Hey, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm gonna talk about top 5 best micro SD card. Starting at number 5. Samsung Evo Plus. Selling for a modest $8.51 at publication time. The Samsung Evo Plus offers solid performance from a highly trusted brand at a very reasonable price. Samsung backs the Evo Plus with a 10-year warranty and claims that the card can survive X-rays, magnetic radiation, and even 72 hours in seawater. Most of us probably aren't worried about submerging a card in water, but it's nice to know that if you waterproof your Raspberry Pi, the card will be fine too. In our tests on the Raspberry Pi 4, the Samsung Evo Plus offered consistently strong application opens, coming within 0.2 to 0.3 seconds of the leader. It also booted in a speedy 24.7 seconds, only 0.7 seconds slower than the Kingston Canvas React. Coming at number 4. Samsung Pro Endurance. While it doesn't win every test, the Samsung Pro Endurance is a great all-around Raspberry Pi microSD card that promises up to 25 times greater longevity than a typical card. While we can't prove or disprove this claim, we do know that Samsung has an excellent reputation in the industry and backs the card with a limited lifetime warranty. The company also says that the card is waterproof, temperature-proof, and X-ray proof. The Samsung Pro Endurance comes close to the leaders on application open times and boot times, while achieving fast transfer speeds on every test on every Pi model. On the Raspberry Pi 4, it achieved the fastest 4K random reads on IOZone and the speediest sequential transfer rate in the Raspberry Pi Diagnostics tool. At number 3. Kingston Canvas React. The Kingston Canvas React was in the upper performance tier on nearly all of our Raspberry Pi microSD card tests, and it stood out by being the fastest booter on both the Raspberry Pi 4 and Raspberry Pi 3B+. It also provided application open times that were consistently among the best. The card's only real downside is modest 4K reads and writes on the Raspberry Pi 4. On the Raspberry Pi 3 and 0, which have a slower microSD card reader, its 4K scores were better relative to the competition. Number 2 of my list. SANDISK Extreme Pro. SANDISK claims that the Extreme Pro can read at up to 100 megabytes per second and write at up to 90 megabytes per second, and has labeled it with a UHS rating of 3, a video speed rating of 30, and an application speed rating of A1. As we note below, these ratings aren't very useful, but nonetheless, this card is indeed one of the fastest around. On the Raspberry Pi 3B+, the SANDISK Extreme Pro finished first in 6 out of 8 IOZone tests, including random 4K reads and writes. On Raspberry Pi 4, the card was within a few tenths of a second of the fastest application open times on the Raspberry Pi 4, and it was 0.5 megabytes per second or less behind the leader in the all-important 4K random read and write speeds on IOZone. It also had the fastest sequential write speed on the Raspberry Pi diagnostic test. And number 1. Silicon Power 3D NAND. We're honestly shocked that the best performing Raspberry Pi microSD card in our roundup is also the cheapest one, and comes from a lesser-known brand. It's also rated UHS Speed 1 rather than 3, although these ratings are largely meaningless. In fact, we were so surprised at this card's performance that we tested a second unit to make sure the first one wasn't a fluke. For a price of just $6.99 at publishing time, the Silicon Power 3D NAND achieved the highest speeds on the Raspberry Pi 4 in almost all the IOZone tests, especially with 4K random writes. It also, by a hair, loaded all of our apps fastest on the Pi 4, though its boot time was second slowest. The Silicon Power NAND 3D card also performed well on Raspberry Pi 3B+ and Pi 0W, though it didn't lead in as many categories. Check out this video description for latest price and more informations. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe and stay tuned.